November 1st, 1952. Eniwetok Atoll, Pacific Ocean. Soviet nuclear engineers sat confidently in Moscow bunkers, reviewing their latest intelligence reports. Their 40-kiloton fission bombs, the same power that leveled Hiroshima, represented the pinnacle of nuclear warfare. American attempts at something called a hydrogen bomb were dismissed as theoretical fantasy. Soviet military doctrine was clear. Their nuclear arsenal was sufficient, superior, unmatched. But 8,000 miles away, in a reinforced bunker on a remote Pacific island, American scientists prepared to detonate something that would shatter every assumption about nuclear weapons. Edward Teller's radical fusion design, mocked by Soviet physicists as impossible, sat waiting on the coral reef. The device didn't look like much: a massive cylinder filled with liquid deuterium, cooled to near absolute zero. At precisely 7:15 a.m. local time, the countdown reached zero. The flash was visible from 200 miles away. The fireball grew larger than 3 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose 25 miles into the stratosphere. When the dust settled and radiation readings came back, the yield numbers were almost incomprehensible: 10.4 megatons, not kilotons. Megatons. The Soviets had just witnessed a weapon 250 times more powerful than anything in their arsenal. American ingenuity had done what Moscow's finest minds called scientifically impossible. If you value forgotten history, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth discovering. Comment your city and local time. We are interested to know where our stories reach. The numbers told the complete story of Soviet nuclear dominance in 1952. Their latest RDS-3 bomb delivered 42 kilotons of explosive power, identical to the American weapons that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But unlike the Americans, who had built fewer than 300 nuclear weapons by this point, Soviet production lines churned out fission devices at an accelerating pace. Intelligence reports flowing into the Pentagon estimated Soviet stockpiles approaching 200 warheads, with new facilities under construction across the Ural Mountains. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin reviewed these capabilities with quiet satisfaction during classified briefings in the Kremlin's underground war rooms. The uranium enrichment plants at Chelyabinsk 40 operated around the clock, processing weapons-grade material through cascades of gas centrifuges that American engineers still struggled to replicate at scale. The plutonium reactors at Mayak produced enough fissile material for 12 new warheads per month. Soviet nuclear doctrine centered on overwhelming numerical superiority backed by delivery systems that could reach any target in Europe or the continental United States. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most trusted military advisor, presented the strategic reality with characteristic bluntness during October meetings with the Politburo. Soviet Tu-4 bombers, reverse-engineered copies of captured American B-29s, could deliver nuclear payloads to London, Paris, or New York City. The Red Army's conventional forces remained the largest in the world, with over 5 million active personnel backed by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. Nuclear weapons served as the ultimate guarantee against Western aggression, but Soviet military planning assumed that conventional forces would determine the outcome of any European conflict. American nuclear capabilities appeared formidable on paper, but suffered from critical limitations that Soviet intelligence had identified through careful analysis of public statements and technical publications. The United States possessed approximately 300 fission weapons by late 1952, but delivery systems remained problematic. The B-36 strategic bomber could carry nuclear payloads across intercontinental distances, but Soviet air defense networks had demonstrated their ability to track and intercept high-altitude aircraft. The Korean War had revealed American vulnerabilities in conventional warfare, suggesting that nuclear superiority alone could not guarantee victory against determined opponents. Soviet engineers dismissed American research into thermonuclear weapons as theoretical speculation without practical military value. The physics of nuclear fusion required temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees Celsius, conditions that existed only in the core of stars. Classified reports from the Soviet Academy of Sciences concluded that any fusion reaction would require more energy input than it could produce, making hydrogen bombs economically and technically unfeasible. Igor Kurchatov, director of the Soviet nuclear program, characterized American fusion research as propaganda designed to intimidate adversaries through impossible promises. The confidence extended throughout Soviet military leadership and scientific establishments. General Pavel Zygarev, commander of the Soviet Air Force, believed that existing fission weapons provided sufficient destructive power for any conceivable military objective. A 40-kiloton explosion could eliminate an entire military installation or destroy the center of a major city. Tactical nuclear weapons with yields between 1 and 10 kilotons could stop armored divisions or eliminate enemy airfields. Strategic planners saw no practical advantage in weapons with greater explosive power, since targets would already be destroyed by existing Soviet bombs. Soviet nuclear doctrine emphasized quantity over individual weapon performance. Military exercises conducted in the Kazakh steppes demonstrated how multiple nuclear strikes could overwhelm enemy defenses and eliminate entire army groups. The psychological impact of nuclear weapons depended more on their availability than their individual destructive capacity. A nation that could threaten dozens of enemy cities simultaneously held strategic advantages that could not be matched by a smaller number of more powerful weapons. Intelligence assessments from the GRU and NKVD reinforced Soviet confidence in their nuclear position. American scientists had conducted thermonuclear experiments at Los Alamos and other facilities, but none had achieved the controlled fusion reactions necessary for weaponization. Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born physicist leading American hydrogen bomb research, had made public statements about fusion weapons since 1946, but no successful tests had been reported. Soviet agents within American nuclear facilities reported technical difficulties and budget constraints that suggested fusion weapons remained years away from practical development. The strategic calculations seemed clear to Soviet leadership as autumn approached. American nuclear capabilities posed serious threats, but Soviet responses had matched each escalation. The atomic monopoly had ended in 1949 when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear device. American advantages in delivery systems were temporary problems that Soviet engineers would solve through improved bombers and eventually ballistic missiles. The nuclear balance favored neither side decisively, creating the stable deterrence that would prevent major power conflicts for the foreseeable future. Soviet confidence in their nuclear position reflected careful analysis of technical realities and strategic mathematics that seemed to confirm their fundamental assumptions about the nature of atomic warfare. Edward Teller paced the corridors of Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory with the intensity of a man convinced he held the key to American survival. The Hungarian-born physicist had spent 6 years developing theoretical frameworks for thermonuclear weapons, but theoretical physics meant nothing without practical demonstration. His calculations indicated that nuclear fusion could produce explosive yields measured in megatons rather than kilotons, a 1,000-fold increase in destructive power that would render existing Soviet arsenals obsolete overnight. The technical challenge appeared insurmountable to most scientists familiar with fusion physics. Nuclear fusion required compressing hydrogen isotopes to densities exceeding those found in stellar cores while simultaneously heating the material to temperatures of 100 million degrees Celsius. The energy required to achieve these conditions exceeded the output of most power plants, yet the entire reaction had to occur within microseconds inside a weapon small enough for aircraft delivery. Teller's proposed solution involved using a fission bomb as a trigger to create the extreme conditions necessary for fusion, but no one had successfully demonstrated controlled thermonuclear reactions under laboratory conditions. Opposition within the American scientific community reflected genuine concerns about both technical feasibility and strategic necessity. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had directed the Manhattan Project that created the first atomic bombs, questioned whether fusion weapons served any meaningful military purpose. His position carried substantial weight among physicists who had witnessed the destructive power of fission weapons firsthand. Oppenheimer argued that existing nuclear arsenals already possessed sufficient destructive capacity to deter Soviet aggression, making more powerful weapons unnecessary escalations that could destabilize international relations. The General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission had voted 8-0 against hydrogen bomb development in October 1949, citing both technical uncertainties and moral objections. Committee members included some of America's most distinguished scientists, including Enrico Fermi and Isidore Rabi, who characterized fusion weapons as inherently evil due to their unlimited destructive potential. Their report concluded that hydrogen bombs would serve no military purpose that could not be achieved through existing nuclear weapons while creating new risks of accidental war or nuclear proliferation. Teller dismissed these objections as dangerous naivety that ignored Soviet capabilities and intentions. His analysis of Soviet nuclear development suggested that Moscow would inevitably pursue fusion weapons regardless of American decisions. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet scientists led by Igor Kurchatov were conducting their own thermonuclear research, though their progress remained difficult to assess through classified channels. Teller believed that unilateral American restraint would simply guarantee Soviet advantages in the next phase of nuclear competition. Military support for hydrogen bomb development came primarily from officers who understood the strategic implications of weapons with unlimited destructive potential. General Curtis LeMay, commander of Strategic Air Command, argued that fusion weapons could eliminate entire Soviet missile complexes or submarine bases with single strikes. Current fission weapons required multiple hits to ensure destruction of hardened military targets, but megaton-yield hydrogen bombs could guarantee mission success against any conceivable target. The psychological impact on Soviet leadership would be equally significant, since American fusion capabilities would demonstrate technological superiority that Moscow could not immediately match. President Harry Truman faced conflicting recommendations from scientific advisors and military commanders throughout the autumn of 1949. The Soviet Union's successful atomic bomb test in August had eliminated America's nuclear monopoly, creating new urgency around fusion weapon development. Truman understood that hydrogen bombs represented either America's path to renewed nuclear superiority or a dangerous escalation that could trigger unlimited arms races. The decision required balancing technical uncertainties against strategic risks that could determine the outcome of the Cold War. The breakthrough came through Teller's collaboration with Stanislaw Ulam, a Polish mathematician who solved critical problems in fusion weapon design. Ulam's calculations demonstrated how radiation pressure from a fission trigger could compress fusion fuel to the densities required for sustained thermonuclear reactions. The Teller-Ulam design eliminated previous technical obstacles through elegant physics that made fusion weapons both theoretically sound and practically achievable. Mathematical models indicated that hydrogen bombs could achieve yields exceeding 10 megatons while remaining small enough for bomber delivery. Soviet responses to American fusion research revealed the dismissive attitude that would prove costly once practical demonstrations became available. Moscow's official statements characterized hydrogen bomb development as American propaganda designed to intimidate neutral nations through impossible threats. Soviet physicists publicly questioned whether controlled fusion reactions could produce more energy than they consumed, suggesting that American claims violated fundamental principles of thermodynamics. These statements reflected genuine technical skepticism rather than deliberate misinformation, indicating that Soviet scientists had not yet solved the theoretical problems that Teller and Ulam had overcome through their collaborative research. The contrast between American innovation and Soviet overconfidence became apparent through intelligence assessments flowing into both capitals during 1950 and 1951. American technical progress accelerated as Los Alamos scientists refined fusion weapon designs and prepared for full-scale testing. Soviet intelligence reports continued to dismiss hydrogen bombs as theoretical impossibilities that posed no immediate threats to existing strategic balances. This fundamental misunderstanding of American capabilities would shape Soviet responses to the events that were rapidly approaching in the Pacific testing grounds. The device that would change nuclear warfare forever occupied a reinforced concrete bunker on Aleutian Island, part of the Enewetak Atoll chain in the Marshall Islands. The Ivy Mike test unit stood 82 inches tall and measured 24 inches in diameter, weighing approximately 82 tons, including its massive cryogenic cooling system. Unlike portable nuclear weapons designed for military deployment, This experimental device served purely as a proof of concept for thermonuclear physics. Liquid deuterium fuel filled the central cylinder, maintained at temperatures approaching absolute zero through continuous refrigeration units that consumed enormous amounts of electrical power. The fusion fuel itself represented the critical innovation that distinguished hydrogen bombs from existing fission weapons. Deuterium, an isotope of hydrogen containing one neutron in addition to the standard proton, would undergo fusion reactions when compressed to extreme densities and heated to stellar temperatures. The Teller-Ulam design achieved these conditions through radiation implosion, where X-rays from a fission trigger compressed the deuterium fuel faster than the expanding fireball could disrupt the reaction. Mathematical calculations indicated that successful fusion would release energy equivalent to 10 million tons of conventional explosives, but theoretical predictions required experimental verification. Scientists from Los Alamos, Livermore, and other facilities had spent 18 months preparing for this single test. The device incorporated lessons learned from previous nuclear experiments, including improved timing mechanisms, enhanced diagnostic equipment, and radiation shielding designed to protect measurement instruments from the unprecedented energy release. Seismographs positioned throughout the Pacific would record the explosion's magnitude, while high-speed cameras captured the fireball's expansion during the first microseconds of detonation. Radiochemical analysis of debris samples would confirm whether fusion reactions had occurred as predicted by theoretical models. At 0615 hours on November 1st, 1952, final arming procedures began under the supervision of Norris Bradbury, director of Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory. Technical personnel evacuated Elugelab Island and relocated to observation bunkers on Innu Island, approximately 10 miles from the test site. The firing circuit connected the device to remote detonation equipment through armored cables buried beneath the coral reef. Weather conditions remained acceptable, with winds carrying radioactive fallout away from populated areas and cloud cover, permitting visual observation of the detonation. The countdown proceeded without technical difficulties as monitoring stations confirmed readiness across the test range. Radio communications linked observation posts with recording equipment positioned at measured distances from ground zero. Scientific instruments included spectrographs, pressure gauges, and neutron detectors calibrated to measure the specific signatures of fusion reactions. These measurements would determine whether the test achieved sustained thermonuclear burning or merely produced an enhanced fission explosion from the deuterium-tritium boost. Detonation occurred at precisely 0715 hours local time. The initial fireball expanded to a diameter of 3 miles within 6 seconds, generating surface temperatures exceeding 50 million degrees Celsius. The explosion vaporized Elugelab Island completely, leaving a crater 1 mile wide and 175 feet deep in the ocean floor. The mushroom cloud rose to a height of 130,000 feet, spreading radioactive debris across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Seismographic stations recorded the explosion as equivalent to a magnitude 6 earthquake. Preliminary yield estimates based on fireball measurements indicated explosive power of approximately 10.4 megatons, over 700 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Radiochemical analysis of collected samples confirmed that sustained fusion reactions had occurred, producing the distinctive isotopic signatures that distinguished thermonuclear explosions from pure fission weapons. The test had successfully demonstrated that hydrogen bombs were not only theoretically possible, but practically achievable with existing technology and materials. The technical success exceeded even optimistic predictions from Los Alamos physicists who had designed the device. Fusion efficiency calculations indicated that approximately 77% of the deuterium fuel had undergone nuclear reactions, releasing energy densities that surpassed all previous nuclear tests combined. The Teller-Ulam design had proven capable of scaling to virtually unlimited yields, limited only by the amount of fusion fuel incorporated into weapon designs. Practical hydrogen bombs could theoretically achieve explosive power measured in hundreds of megatons. News of the test results reached Washington within hours through encrypted communications channels linking the test site with Pentagon command centers. President Truman received detailed briefings on November 2nd that confirmed American mastery of thermonuclear weapons technology. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to military planners who recognized that hydrogen bombs would render existing Soviet nuclear arsenals obsolete. A single American thermocouple device delivered by long-range bomber could destroy targets that would require dozens of Soviet fission weapons to eliminate completely. Soviet intelligence networks detected the Ivy Mike test through seismographic monitoring stations and radioactive fallout measurements conducted by their own scientific facilities. Initial reports reaching Moscow indicated that American scientists had achieved an explosive yield far exceeding any previous nuclear test, but Soviet physicists remained skeptical about whether true fusion reactions had occurred. The magnitude of the explosion suggested that the Americans had simply built a much larger fission weapon, rather than achieving the controlled thermonuclear reactions that Soviet scientists considered theoretically impossible. This fundamental misunderstanding would delay effective Soviet responses to American thermonuclear capabilities for months, allowing the United States to establish overwhelming nuclear superiority that would reshape Cold War strategic calculations permanently. The seismic readings from Ivy Mike reached Soviet monitoring stations within hours of detonation, creating immediate confusion among scientists who had dismissed Americans of fusion research as theoretical impossibility. Instruments at Semipalatinsk detected ground tremors equivalent to a magnitude 6 earthquake originating from the Pacific test site, suggesting an explosive yield far exceeding any known nuclear weapon. Initial calculations indicated that the American device had produced destructive power approaching 10 megatons, but Soviet physicists struggled to explain how such yields could be achieved through existing nuclear technology. Igor Kurchatov convened emergency meetings at the Soviet Nuclear Research Facility in Arzamas-16 within 72 hours of receiving preliminary test data. The physicist who had led Soviet atomic bomb development found himself confronting evidence that contradicted fundamental assumptions about thermonuclear weapons. Radiochemical analysis of atmospheric samples collected by Soviet monitoring aircraft confirmed the presence of fusion byproducts, indicating that American scientists had successfully initiated sustained hydrogen burning under controlled conditions. The implications were staggering for a nuclear program that had based its strategic planning on the impossibility of practical fusion weapons. Andrei Sakharov, the brilliant theoretical physicist leading Soviet hydrogen bomb research, recognized immediately that the Ivy Mike test represented a technological breakthrough that Soviet science had not anticipated. His previous calculations had suggested that fusion weapons remained years away from practical development, requiring advances in materials science and nuclear engineering that neither superpower possessed. The American success indicated that fundamental problems in thermonuclear physics had been solved through innovative design approaches that Soviet researchers had not considered or dismissed as unworkable. Stalin demanded immediate acceleration of Soviet fusion weapon development during Politburo meetings held in the Kremlin during the second week of November 1952. The aging Soviet leader understood that American thermonuclear capabilities posed existential threats to Soviet security that could not be countered through conventional military responses. Soviet nuclear doctrine required parity with American capabilities to maintain credible deterrence, but achieving fusion weapon technology would require massive resource commitments and fundamental changes to existing research priorities. The crash program to develop Soviet hydrogen bombs faced technical obstacles that American scientists had already overcome through their collaboration on the Teller-Ulam design. Soviet physicists lacked detailed knowledge of radiation implosion techniques that enabled efficient compression of fusion fuel to critical densities. Their theoretical models indicated that achieving thermonuclear ignition would require fission triggers with yields exceeding existing Soviet nuclear weapons, creating engineering challenges that would delay weapon development for months or years. Kurchatov assigned teams of physicists and engineers to reverse engineer American fusion technology through analysis of test debris and atmospheric samples. Soviet intelligence services received orders to prioritize acquisition of technical information about hydrogen bomb design, but American security measures had limited access to classified fusion research. Espionage networks that had provided crucial information during atomic bomb development found themselves excluded from Los Alamos facilities where thermonuclear weapons were being perfected for military deployment. The Soviet response revealed fundamental weaknesses in nuclear research infrastructure that had been masked by earlier successes with fission weapons. Soviet uranium enrichment facilities lacked the capacity to produce weapons-grade materials required for large-scale hydrogen bomb production. Plutonium reactors at Mayak could not supply sufficient fissile material for both existing nuclear weapons and the powerful triggers required for fusion devices. Industrial limitations that seemed manageable during atomic bomb development became critical bottlenecks when applied to thermonuclear weapon requirements. Research teams at Arzamas 16 struggled with theoretical problems that American physicists had solved through mathematical insights unavailable to Soviet scientists. The physics of radiation-driven implosion required complex calculations involving hydrodynamics, thermodynamics, and nuclear reaction rates that exceeded computational capabilities available to Soviet researchers. Without access to the specific techniques developed by Teller and Ulam, Soviet attempts to achieve controlled fusion remained theoretical exercises rather than practical weapon designs. American intelligence services monitored Soviet responses to Ivy Mike through signals intercepts and reconnaissance flights that revealed the panic spreading through Soviet nuclear establishments. Communications between Moscow and research facilities indicated that Soviet scientists were attempting to duplicate American achievements without understanding the fundamental principles that made fusion weapons possible. Pentagon analysts concluded that Soviet hydrogen bomb development would require significantly longer than originally estimated, providing the United States with a temporary but decisive advantage in nuclear capabilities. The strategic implications became apparent to Soviet military planners who recognized that American thermonuclear weapons had fundamentally altered the nuclear balance. A single American hydrogen bomb could destroy targets that would require dozens of Soviet fission weapons to eliminate completely. Soviet air defense systems designed to intercept bomber formations carrying multiple nuclear weapons would prove inadequate against single aircraft delivering megaton-yield fusion devices. The mathematical calculations were sobering for military leaders, who had based their defensive planning on the assumption that nuclear weapons would remain limited to kiloton yields. Soviet confidence in their nuclear position eroded as intelligence reports confirmed that American scientists were preparing additional thermonuclear tests, while Soviet researchers remained trapped in theoretical speculation. The technological gap that had emerged overnight threatened to become permanent if Soviet fusion research could not match American achievements within months rather than years. The race to develop practical hydrogen bombs had begun with the Soviet Union facing a deficit that would require extraordinary efforts to overcome, assuming such efforts could succeed at all given the fundamental technical challenges that remained unsolved within Soviet nuclear research programs. The shockwaves from Ivy Mike reverberated through NATO headquarters in Paris within days of the test, fundamentally altering Western military planning and alliance relationships. General Matthew Ridgway, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, received classified briefings confirming that American thermonuclear capabilities had rendered existing Soviet nuclear threats manageable through overwhelming deterrence. NATO's conventional force requirements could be reduced significantly if American hydrogen bombs guaranteed destruction of Soviet military targets that previously required sustained air campaigns with hundreds of aircraft and nuclear weapons. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded immediate access to American fusion technology during emergency sessions, with President Truman held in Washington during late November 1952. Britain's independent nuclear program had achieved successful fission weapons through close cooperation with American scientists, but hydrogen bomb development required resources and expertise that exceeded British capabilities. Churchill recognized that thermonuclear weapons represented the next phase of nuclear competition, and British exclusion from American fusion research would relegate the United Kingdom to secondary status among nuclear powers. French President Vincent Auriol reached similar conclusions about the strategic implications of hydrogen bombs for European security and French national interests. France had initiated independent nuclear research programs in 1945, but progress remained limited by resource constraints and technical difficulties that seemed insignificant compared to the challenges of fusion weapon development. The Ivy Mike demonstration indicated that nuclear weapons technology had advanced beyond the capabilities of middle powers, creating a bipolar nuclear world dominated by American and eventual Soviet thermonuclear arsenals. Soviet allies throughout Eastern Europe received urgent communications from Moscow describing American hydrogen bombs as propaganda weapons designed to intimidate neutral nations through exaggerated claims about destructive power. These messages reflected ongoing Soviet disbelief about the technical feasibility of megaton-yield weapons rather than deliberate deception of Allied governments. Polish and Czechoslovakian military leaders were instructed to maintain existing defense planning based on the assumption that nuclear weapons remained limited to kiloton yields comparable to those demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The psychological impact on neutral nations exceeded the immediate military implications, as governments throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America recognized that nuclear warfare had escalated beyond anything previously contemplated. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru characterized hydrogen bombs as qualitatively different from atomic weapons, representing unlimited destructive potential that made nuclear conflict unacceptable under any circumstances. The non-aligned movement gained momentum as smaller nations sought alternatives to alliance with superpowers possessing weapons capable of destroying entire regions. American military doctrine underwent fundamental revision as Strategic Air Command incorporated hydrogen bomb capabilities into operational planning. General Curtis LeMay ordered preparation of target lists that reflected the enhanced destructive power of thermonuclear weapons, identifying Soviet industrial complexes and military installations that could be eliminated through single bombing missions rather than sustained campaigns. The efficiency gains were substantial for Air Force planning that had previously required multiple nuclear strikes against hardened targets to ensure destruction. Soviet diplomatic responses revealed the confusion and desperation that characterized Moscow's reaction to American thermonuclear superiority. Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky delivered speeches at the United Nations denouncing hydrogen bombs as crimes against humanity, while simultaneously demanding international agreements to prohibit fusion weapon development. These contradictory positions reflected internal Soviet debates about whether to acknowledge American technical achievements or maintain the fiction that thermonuclear weapons remained impossible to develop and deploy. Intelligence assessments prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency during December 1952 confirmed that Soviet nuclear research programs faced insurmountable obstacles in duplicating American fusion technology. Intercepted communications between Soviet research facilities indicated that theoretical work on hydrogen bombs continued, but practical weapon development remained stalled by fundamental technical problems that American scientists had solved through innovations unavailable to Soviet researchers. The intelligence suggested that Soviet thermonuclear capabilities would require years to achieve, providing the United States with extended nuclear superiority. Economic implications became apparent as defense contractors recognized that hydrogen bombs would reshape military procurement and strategic planning. Boeing and Convair received contracts to develop delivery systems specifically designed for thermonuclear weapons, including intercontinental bombers capable of carrying megaton-yield devices across global distances. The reduced number of weapons required to achieve strategic objectives would decrease production costs while increasing the importance of delivery system reliability and accuracy. The international arms control regime established through the United Nations faced obsolescence as hydrogen bombs exceeded all previous assumptions about nuclear weapons regulation. Existing proposals for nuclear disarmament had assumed that atomic weapons could be controlled through limits on fissile material production and delivery systems, but thermonuclear technology made such approaches ineffective. A single hydrogen bomb possessed more destructive power than entire nuclear arsenals contemplated by arms control negotiators during the immediate post-war period. American public opinion remained largely unaware of the technical details that distinguished fusion weapons from atomic bombs, but polling data indicated growing confidence in national security following the Ivy Mike test. President Truman's approval ratings increased as Americans recognized that their country had achieved decisive technological advantages over Soviet adversaries. The psychological benefits of nuclear superiority provided political capital that Truman utilized to strengthen NATO commitments and resist Soviet pressure in ongoing diplomatic negotiations over European security arrangements. The Cold War had entered a new phase characterized by American dominance in the most destructive military technology ever developed, fundamentally altering the global balance of power in ways that would persist for decades. Edward Teller stood in his office at the University of California Radiation Laboratory in Livermore, reviewing classified reports that confirmed the complete success of his theoretical work on thermonuclear weapons. The Ivy Mike test had validated mathematical models developed over 6 years of intensive research, proving that controlled nuclear fusion could produce explosive yields limited only by the amount of fuel incorporated into weapon designs. The device that had vaporized Elugelab Island represented the culmination of scientific innovation that had overcome theoretical obstacles deemed insurmountable by critics within the American physics community. The strategic transformation was already visible in Pentagon planning documents that reflected hydrogen bomb capabilities in target selection and force structure requirements. American military doctrine had shifted from reliance on large numbers of atomic weapons to precision strikes with individual fusion devices capable of eliminating entire Soviet military complexes. Strategic Air Command revised its operational plans to incorporate thermonuclear weapons that could destroy hardened targets through single bombing missions, reducing aircraft requirements while increasing mission effectiveness against Soviet strategic forces. Soviet responses to American thermonuclear superiority revealed the depth of technological miscalculation that had characterized their nuclear planning. Intelligence reports reaching Washington indicated that Soviet scientists remained unable to duplicate the Teller-Ulam design principles that enabled practical fusion weapons. Moscow's attempts to develop hydrogen bombs continued through theoretical research programs, but practical weapon development faced fundamental obstacles that American scientists had solved through innovative approaches to radiation implosion and fuel compression techniques. The global strategic balance reflected American nuclear dominance in ways that extended beyond military calculations to encompass diplomatic and economic dimensions of international relations. NATO allies recognized that American hydrogen bombs provided security guarantees that made independent nuclear programs less critical for national defense. British and French nuclear research continued, but the resource requirements for fusion weapon development exceeded the capabilities of middle powers attempting to maintain strategic autonomy through indigenous military technology. American nuclear stockpile expansion accelerated as Los Alamos and Livermore laboratories perfected deliverable hydrogen bombs based on lessons learned from the Ivy Mike experiment. The Castle test series, scheduled for early 1954, would demonstrate practical fusion weapons small enough for aircraft delivery while maintaining explosive yields measured in megatons. These operational hydrogen bombs would provide American military commanders with unprecedented destructive capabilities that could eliminate Soviet strategic targets through minimal force commitment. Soviet nuclear doctrine faced fundamental revision as military planners confronted the reality that American thermonuclear weapons had rendered existing Soviet advantages in conventional forces largely irrelevant. A single American hydrogen bomb could destroy entire Army divisions or eliminate major industrial complexes that would require months of conventional bombing campaigns to neutralize. Soviet strategic planning assumptions based on numerical superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery became obsolete when confronted with weapons capable of destroying military formations through individual strikes. The technological gap between American and Soviet nuclear capabilities created strategic windows that American military leaders recognized as temporary advantages requiring immediate exploitation. General Curtis LeMay advocated for preventive war against the Soviet Union before Moscow could develop effective hydrogen bomb capabilities, arguing that American thermonuclear superiority provided decisive advantages that would disappear once Soviet fusion weapons became operational. President Truman rejected such proposals, but the strategic logic reflected the revolutionary impact of fusion technology on Cold War military calculations. Economic implications of hydrogen bomb development extended throughout American defense industries, as contractors adapted production lines to incorporate thermonuclear weapons into military procurement programs. The reduced numbers of weapons required to achieve strategic objectives decreased manufacturing costs while increasing emphasis on delivery system accuracy and reliability. Boeing's B-52 strategic bomber program incorporated design specifications optimized for hydrogen bomb delivery, including enhanced navigation systems and defensive countermeasures designed to penetrate Soviet air defense networks. Soviet intelligence services intensified efforts to acquire American fusion technology through espionage networks and technical analysis of test debris, but security measures surrounding thermonuclear research limited access to critical design information. The compartmentalized nature of hydrogen bomb development restricted knowledge to small groups of cleared scientists and engineers, making penetration significantly more difficult than the broader atomic bomb programs that had provided Soviet agents with crucial technical data during the 1940s. International arms control negotiations faced obsolescence as hydrogen bombs exceeded all previous assumptions about nuclear weapons regulation and limitation agreements. Existing proposals for nuclear disarmament had assumed that atomic weapons could be controlled through restrictions on fissile material production, but fusion technology made such approaches ineffective since thermonuclear fuel could be produced through conventional industrial processes. The unlimited destructive potential of hydrogen bombs created new categories of military capability that existing arms control frameworks could not address effectively. The Cold War strategic landscape had been permanently transformed through American mastery of thermonuclear technology that provided decisive military advantages over Soviet nuclear capabilities. The confidence that had characterized Soviet nuclear planning during 1951 and 1952 had been shattered by scientific achievements that Moscow's physicists had dismissed as theoretical impossibilities. American ingenuity had achieved what Soviet doctrine considered unattainable, creating nuclear superiority that would shape superpower competition for the remainder of the 1950s and establish American technological leadership that would define Cold War dynamics through multiple decades of strategic competition.